Today, we're diving into the fascinating and complex world of the ego death. We'll explore what the ego death is, the history, what it feels like to have an ego death, and how it can be achieved, and the benefits of the ego death. But let's first start off with all the basics. Before we start to talk about ego death, we have to understand, of course, what the ego is. And for that, we touch upon our boy Sigmund Freud. He was an Austrian neurologist and the founder of psychoanalysis. Freud gave us a very distinctive theory about the mind, with concepts like the ego, the ID, and the superego, which are key to understanding the ego death. Think of the ID as the inner child, demanding ice cream and snaps and mostly reacting to the needs of the impulses. The superego is more like the stern librarian and wants you to follow the rules. And the ego, it's the exhausted parent that balances the two. One important part from the ego is also its defense mechanism. And Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, built on his work, suggesting that while we can't observe our defenses in action, we can later on always look back and recognize our patterns and behaviors. So this comes down to how you, for example, react to stressful interactions. Let's say that you have a relationship with someone, but you two get into a fight. What most likely will happen is that you will get irritated, annoyed, and that your defense mechanism will react in a certain way. Some people become silent, other people become mad. And it's really interesting and important to recognize the behaviors and the patterns around this. This is also what Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, is talking about when she's talking about the defense mechanisms. Because our ego will be aligned with pain or sadness or being mad, instead of having an overview of the whole situation that could make it that you relativate the whole situation. Now that we know what the ego is, what is the ego death then? There are some terms for this. Some people talk about ego dissolution or ego loss. Ego death is basically a phenomenon often linked with spiritual practices and the use of psychedelics. People who have experienced ego death describe it as a feeling of losing one's self, a way of letting go of parts of your identity. Imagine looking back at the person that you used to be, or that you imagined yourself to be, and not recognizing it anymore. That's the classic ego death, basically, shedding your old identity and reconstructing a new you. And from my own experience, this is also what I have experienced. I started to play with this topic and challenge myself for an ego death once I started to be busy with psychedelics. It helped me out a great deal because before all of that, as I mentioned in other videos as well, I was running away from myself. And I wasn't dealing with the pain and the sadness and the trauma that I experienced before. But it also meant that I had to change the perspective on myself. And the ego death allowed me to take a step back from everything that I experienced. And that changed my whole perspective. The spiritual history. Ego death is not a new concept. It has been explored in philosophy and psychology for centuries already. The idea is that our normal sense of self can be transcended into a higher level of ourself. We can, for example, find it in Christianity. Ego death there is seen as surrendering to God, leaving behind the old self and being reborn through the transformative power of baptism. It's viewed as essential for spiritual growth and union with God. If we look more into Eastern traditions, in Buddhism and Hinduism for example, ego death is often referred to as nirvana. It involves letting go of attachments to achieve a higher state of consciousness or enlightenment. It's about spiritual liberation beyond desire. And then we also have indigenous spiritual traditions. Many indigenous view ego death with reverence. Practices like fasting, prayer, and vision quests are used to alter one's perception and bring about spiritual insights. And if I look at my own view of the ego death, I pick certain elements out of all the things here. Yes, I think that due to having my ego death, I'm more aligned with life or God or the universe, I would say. I don't look at it from the religious side because of the institution, but I definitely see it that God either will take care of me, but there are also certain things that I should do to align myself with God, life, or however you want to name it. If I look back at Buddhism and Hinduism, what I really understand here is that everything that you own is also baggage that you put value to. And the question here is that all necessary? Because at one point we will leave this planet, and what is the value of owning things then? And then lastly, yes, I fast, yes, I eat in a certain way, and yes, I don't eat certain things that I keep myself away from, because I know that it keeps me away from my spiritual self. There's also controversy around ego death. Some see it as something dangerous or contrary to traditional religious views, arguing it could lead to moral relativism. Once you start to have ego death and practice with it, you will see that you start to distance yourself from the ego, the I, and start to see that certain things in life are less relevant or important than they are made to be. Your reality is also built around that. So yes, it makes sense that certain people, if we talk about politics, geopolitics, or whatever it might be, some things are really important for people. But if you imagine that humanity has been around for thousands of years already, then you could question if things are really necessary or if things are really that important as they are shown. Ego death certainly challenges certain perspectives of how society works, but also to how you see yourself. What does the ego death feel like? The experience around ego death is really personal, but there are certain things that we can look at. Some people describe it as life-changing and transcendent, while other people may see it as minor changes or nothing at all. But that also depends on how you are brought up. I come from a background with my dad being a deacon, and although you would say that I would have a spiritual sense from there, as a kid I didn't like the religious part of it, the institution part. And being brought up in such a conservative background, the step that I made from having an ego death to where I am now has been life-changing. But that, of course, depends on how you are brought up and what background you have. But there are some common experiences that are included. So you look at the dissolving of the identity, or at least creating something new. Loss of boundaries between how you thought the world worked and how the world actually works. An emotional, psychological, and spiritual transformation. And people often feel enlightened afterwards. But this enlightenment can come also with confusion, because it will take time to have this whole experience. It's not necessarily like you have an ego death and then everything will change from one day or the other. Yes, you will get different perspectives, but you will have to keep on developing that. And I especially want to say this for when people are trying to achieve this through drugs. Yes, you can have certain doors opened in your mind when you do this through psychedelics, for example. But there is still a step to make, and that one takes time to take everything that you learn to practice that in your normal life. And please take into account that if you do it through drugs, that you are not that only that identity on drugs. So now I want to take you along in how you can achieve ego death. If you are curious about experiencing the ego death, I want to touch upon two practices mostly, and those are the psychedelics and meditation. Yes, there are also some sort of out-of-body experiences or breath work, but I don't necessarily have experiences with it, and I want to explain it in the best possible way. Let's talk about psychedelics. Substances like mushrooms, for example, LSD, DMT are popular for inducing an ego death. They open certain doors in your head towards your consciousness, creating a feeling of that you're transcending yourself beyond the normal perspective. There is also some studies in this, in where you can see that the connections that you normally make in your head, they are increased. You can also do this through meditation. By meditation, you can also look at life in an introspective way. And meditation can help dismantle certain beliefs about identity or opening space for a new perspective of yourself. For both these methods, you have a certain clinching feeling towards life, for example. I recognize that for myself in how I was brought up, in what I experienced here in Berlin, and what I did on later on to get rid of that. And that is something that just really takes time. I did that both with psychedelics, but also through meditation. The process itself opens up new space, new ways to perceive yourself in a certain way, at least to challenge your old self and untangle everything that you learned before. Lastly, for some people, ego death can also just happen spontaneously due to a certain important experience that they had. It's then like a sudden spiritual awakening. Also here, I would definitely say, take your time with this. Ego death isn't just a one-step process. To further and easier to explain it, I want to take you along to the 4 stages of it. The first one is the spiritual awakening, the initial realization that the ego no longer controls you. So if you always react out of your impulse or out of what your ego is telling you, your ego in that instance is in control of how you always react. And this might not always be the best way. I will never say that your ego is a bad thing, because your ego can also help you out a great deal in your life. Life is duality, so it's more about balance than just to say, I don't trust my ego anymore. Then after the spiritual awakening, we go towards the dark night of the soul. And this is a period just simply of questioning yourself and your identity. And this might be confusing, and this might also be hard. Because on one hand, your ego will tell you like, well, I believed in all these things. And then your character is sort of confused like, yeah, but it's not like that. And this period takes energy, time, and really you can see here a big distinction in how people react to the soul. Some people will always cling to their ego, because this period can also be sadness and pain and looking at things differently. Once people start to accept that, then you get into the exploration and curiosity phase, because you will create a certain void. A void in where you have to ask yourself, okay, who am I then as a person if it's not everything for what my ego is telling me? What are the things that I'm aligned with your true self? And for myself, that goes that I want the best for everyone and that I have a lot of love and light to give. And the last period is basically after you start to explore everything to further align this in your life in terms of soul growth and enlightenment. Embracing who you are will take time, and living in a higher state and seeing the world for what it is, it will also take time. I think the most joyful thing that I got out of this whole period, if I would walk through a forest when I was younger, even if it would be summer, everything was sort of gray because I wasn't happy with myself. And later on, the biggest thing that the ego death gave me was that if I walk into the forest now, everything is colorful, it's bright, it's joyful, and it's just such a whole change in my head. There are also some health benefits or mental benefits to the ego death. There are some people that report letting go of trauma. Also for myself, my ego death period taught me a great deal about distancing myself from certain traumatic experiences, having more empathy towards the people that I had struggled with, for example. It will align yourself with the universe, or at least bring you closer to yourself, and you will get to know yourself better, and especially freedom from impulses. We currently live with a phone that is always triggering us. We live with a computer that is always triggering us. We live in a society where we can just always get everything. Think about smoking, drinking, drugs. It's all available in the now. And being able to really step away and understanding your patterns and behaviors in how they are created towards impulses is so helpful, because it's a step of freedom. So think of the ego death as a transformational process that can lead to personal growth and a deeper connection to the world, to yourself, and also to the people around you, because you get to know yourself better. So I hope this all combines in a video that will explain everything that the ego death is, how it can be achieved, and how you can get yourself there, or what the benefits are. For me personally, it's one of the greatest steps that I have ever taken. And I see the undeniable joy of the unique perspective that I got from myself, but also my whole consciousness. So I hope you liked the video. Let me know if you have any questions about ego death, or just my process, my journey, or let me know how your journey around ego death was. I'm really interested in reading those kinds of stories. I find that always really interesting to see the personal development that people make. And then for now, there's nothing else to say than big hug, much love, and then I see you in the next one. Ciao, ciao.